Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's story, where trust is tested and love is put on the line. Diep, once full of life and dreams, finds herself lost in a world of uncertainty, caught between her past and a future she's too afraid to face. James, a man of power and ambition, has spent every waking moment searching for her, not just to find her, but to heal the broken pieces of their shared past. But as they come face to face at the edge of a bridge, can James convince her to return? Or is it too late for them to reclaim what they once had? Don't forget to subscribe and follow their journey to redemption and love. Stay tuned. The early morning sun struggled to break through the heavy mist, casting a soft, pale light over the silent landscape. Diep, trembling with hunger, stumbled across a fruit tree on the edge of the forest. The fruit, though unfamiliar, glistened under the damp leaves, tempting her with its sweet fragrance. She hesitated, unsure of its edibility, but her stomach growled louder than her doubts. "I don't know if this fruit is edible," she muttered to herself, her voice barely a whisper in the vast emptiness. But the hunger gnawed at her insides, urging her to try. With a small sigh, she plucked a fruit from the tree and took a tentative bite. The sweet taste filled her senses, soothing the emptiness inside. It smells so fragrant," she thought, her eyes widening as the sweetness lingered on her tongue. She picked a few more and devoured them, unaware of the consequences of her gluttony. The fruit's intoxicating sweetness quickly overtook her senses. Soon, her vision blurred, and her limbs grew heavy. Her world faded to darkness. Meanwhile, James, hundreds of miles away, stood by his office window, staring out at the endless horizon. His thoughts were consumed by Diep. It had been days, almost a week, since she disappeared. The silence in the room mirrored the silence in his heart. He clutched his phone tightly, the screen still showing her last message, the one with no answers, no clues. "I have to find her," he murmured to himself, the words barely leaving his lips. The hope he had been holding on to seemed to slip through his fingers like sand, but he couldn't give up. Not yet. His eyes narrowed in determination. There had to be something, some trace of her somewhere. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows as James drove through the quiet, unfamiliar streets. His thoughts were a whirlwind, frustration, fear, and the faintest flicker of hope. His search had led him down countless dead ends, each road colder than the last, each clue slipping through his fingers like sand. He stopped at a small roadside cafe, staring at his phone, refreshing the same messages over and over, hoping for any sign. "No news, again," he muttered to himself, eyes scanning the horizon as if Diep would appear from the mist, a lost star finding her way home. He couldn't fathom it. How could someone just disappear? He'd searched every corner of the city, combed through places she might have been, but still, no trace. His mind kept drifting back to their last moments together, the softness in her voice, the way her eyes had sparkled with mischief. It all felt so unfinished. "I can't lose her," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He thought of the moments they shared, the quiet smiles, the unspoken words. Was it possible she didn't want to be found? Or was she out there, waiting for him to reach her? Suddenly, his phone rang, the sharp sound cutting through the silence. His heart raced as he saw the unknown number. Could this be news of Diep? "Hello?" His voice was steady, but his shoulders tensed in anticipation. "We might have a lead," came the voice on the other end. someone spotted her near the outskirts of the city by the old bridge. A rush of hope flooded his chest. This was it. He couldn't waste another second. "I'm on my way," James replied, already moving toward the door, his mind focused on the road ahead. This was the chance he had been waiting for. He wouldn't lose her this time. Diep slowly stirred, the soft rays of the morning sun filtering through the window. Her body felt heavy, the effects of the strange fruit still clouding her senses. She tried to sit up, but dizziness pulled her back to the bed, and she blinked in confusion. Where was she? The last thing she remembered was picking those fruits, the sweetness overwhelming her hunger, then falling into darkness. As her vision cleared, a figure emerged from the shadows. A woman, calm and composed, standing by the window. Her eyes met Diep's with a quiet concern. "You're awake," she said softly, her voice soothing. "How do you feel?" Diep could barely speak, her words tangled in the haze of her thoughts. Where am I?" she whispered, still struggling to orient herself. "You're safe," the woman reassured, moving closer with a glass of water. "You fainted by the road and I brought you here. Don't worry, you'll be all right." Diep's eyes searched the woman's face, finding kindness but also a distance she couldn't quite explain. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she murmured, feeling both grateful and guilty. The woman smiled gently, shaking her head. "No trouble at all. Just rest now. You've been through enough." Diep nodded, her thoughts drifting. She knew she couldn't stay here forever, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to let go of the urgency. For now, all she needed to do was breathe. The air was thick with the weight of expectation as James drove, his hands gripping the wheel with a determination that had been growing inside him for days. Each minute that passed seemed like an eternity, each second inching him closer to a place he had been chasing but could never quite reach. The thought of Diep, lost and alone somewhere out there, gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that every step he took brought him closer to losing her forever. His phone rang, breaking the silence in the car. Its sharp sound like a sudden shock. His heart raced as he glanced at the screen, seeing an unknown number. Could this be it? Could this be the news he had been waiting for? "Hello?" he answered, his voice steady, though the tension in his chest betrayed him. "We might have a lead," came the voice on the other end. Someone reported seeing her near the outskirts, near the old bridge. Hope surged through James's veins like a burst of energy. "Where exactly?" he asked, his voice tightening with urgency. "Trunk Truk," the voice replied. "It's a small area, but it's worth checking." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, James couldn't breathe. The prospect of finding her, of seeing her again, filled him with both relief and fear. He could no longer afford to wait. The road ahead was clearer now, and he could almost feel her presence, just out of reach, waiting for him to catch up. "I'm on my way," he said, already making a sharp turn down the road, the engine of the car roaring to life beneath him. The road stretched endlessly before him, winding through fields and empty spaces that seemed to blur together in the growing dusk. James barely noticed the passing scenery. His mind was consumed by one thing: finding Diep. Each turn of the wheel felt like a step closer to something unknown, something both fragile and precious. The tension in his chest had settled into a steady ache, but there was also a flicker of hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in days. As the landscape shifted, the sky deepened into shades of violet and gold, casting a haunting light on the world around him. The journey felt interminable, the weight of each passing mile heavy on his shoulders. He wasn't sure why he kept going, whether it was the certainty that he would find her or the fear that he wouldn't. "Please, let this lead be real," he whispered to himself, gripping the wheel tighter. His voice barely reached his own ears, drowned out by the sound of the tires against the gravel road. He hadn't felt this kind of hope in so long, but with it came an unbearable pressure. He couldn't afford to fail her. She had to be out there, somewhere. The road twisted and turned, the night deepening, but something inside him urged him forward. The bridge at Trung Truk loomed ahead, faintly illuminated by the weak light of distant lanterns. His pulse quickened as he neared the spot. Every instinct screamed that this was the moment. The car rolled to a slow stop, the engine quieting as James stepped out, his eyes scanning the area. There was no sign of her yet, but the night was young. The search was far from over. The cool night air wrapped around James as he stepped onto the gravel near the bridge, his breath forming visible clouds in the faint light. He stood still for a moment, absorbing the eerie quiet of the place, the weight of it all pressing down on him. The thought that Diep might be so close, yet still unreachable, was a heavy burden. He scanned the shadows, every rustle of the wind making him turn his head, his heart leaping in his chest. "Where are you, Diep?" he murmured, almost to himself. His feet moved instinctively, stepping forward, one cautious footfall after another, as if he were following an invisible thread leading him deeper into the night. The sound of a phone ringing broke the stillness. James's heart jumped at the familiar tone, and he quickly pulled it out, his hands trembling as he answered. "James," the voice on the other end was urgent. "We've received word. She's been spotted near the old bridge in the area you're at now. She might still be close. Keep looking." His chest tightened with renewed hope, but it was tempered with a growing sense of urgency. "I'm here," he said, his voice steady. "I'll keep looking, don't worry." As he hung up, the weight of his promise to both himself and to Diep became almost too much to bear. He had come so far, driven by the need to make things right, to find her, to fix the mess they had created. His steps grew quicker, a sense of something, of someone, just ahead. Something he could feel but not yet see. And then, in the dim light of the bridge, he thought he saw it. A figure. The figure ahead was still, almost too still, like a shadow waiting to be claimed by the night. James's heart skipped a beat as he took a step closer, each movement slow, deliberate. The distance between them seemed to stretch and shrink with every passing second. His breath caught in his throat, and for a brief moment time seemed to stretch out in front of him, infinite and uncertain. He stopped just a few feet away, the figure finally becoming clear. It was her, Diep. She stood at the edge of the bridge, her back to him, staring out into the darkness. Her posture was tense, as if she'd been waiting for something, or someone. But she didn't turn, didn't acknowledge his presence. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the wind and the distant rustling of the trees filled the space between them, thick and suffocating. James could feel the weight of his own emotions pressing against him, threatening to break through. All the fear, the hope, the desperation. It all built up inside him like a storm. Finally, he broke the silence. "Diep," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, filled with both relief and uncertainty. "Diep, it's me, James." She stiffened, but didn't move. Her eyes, though, were closed tight, as if she were trying to shut out the world. He stepped forward, his hands shaking as he reached out, but she stepped back, her voice barely audible in the wind. I couldn't come back, James," she said, her voice thin, fragile. "I couldn't face you, not like this." His heart clenched. The distance between them was more than physical now. It was something deeper, something that neither time nor effort could undo. "Diep, please," he said, his voice breaking. "We can fix this. I can't lose you." For a long moment she stood still, her back still turned, but then she finally spoke, her voice trembling. "You never lost me, James," she whispered, her words soft but firm. "But I've lost myself." And in that moment, with the cold wind sweeping over them and the night stretching endlessly around them, James knew that they were both standing on the edge. But whether they could step back together was a choice that only the silence could answer. Diep, lost and overwhelmed by her past, finds herself at a breaking point, standing alone by an old bridge. James, the man who once shared her dreams, has been searching tirelessly for her, desperate to fix the rift between them. As they meet once again, the weight of their unspoken emotions hangs heavy. James wants to heal their broken relationship, but Diep struggles with the fear of returning to a love she feels she's lost. Can they find their way back to each other, or has time pulled them too far apart? This is a story of love, regret, and the fragile line between hope and despair. Stay tuned to see if they can rediscover what they once had.